So today what I'm going to talk about is a strategic framework for managing geopolitical risks in global supply chain. Okay. My name is Shiliang Cui. I'm from Georgetown University's McDonough School of Business in the United States. This is joint work with actually a big group of people. Uh, they're from uh, a, prestigious institutions all over the world. So we have been working with as a team for a long time. So this is our latest uh, research on supply chain. Okay, so um, supply chains have always faced disruption risks, right? And that's why we supply chain researchers, right, and supply chain managers in the company, that's basically our full-time job, right, to deal with supply chain disruptions. So if you think about supply chain disruptions, right, it could include the natural disasters, right? It could include the supply bankruptcies, right, and even the supply disruption from the COVID-19 pandemic, right? But most recently, geopolitical risks have become a major concern for multinational companies, right? So what is a geopolitical risk? I think most of you are very familiar with this concept. But here's a definition from a recent AER article. So this article defines geopolitical risks as the risk that is associated with wars, terrorist acts, and the tensions between states that affect the normal and the peaceful course of international relations, right? So geopolitical risk captures both the risk that these events have either materialized or any new risks, right, that could uh, uh, escalate uh, based on the existing events, right? So let me just give you some examples, right? So recently, the U.S. President-elect Donald Trump, he announced plans to impose substantial tariffs on goods from China, Mexico, and Canada on day one when he returns to the White House, right, on January the 20th, 2025. I think it's going to be 10% on goods produced from China and 25% on goods produced from Mexico and Canada, right? Another example is the war in Ukraine, right? Where almost all Western countries have banned most trade with Russian companies. Okay, and also the third example here, there's also a threat currently that the war in the Mid East could develop into a major armed conflict, right? So if that's the case, it will definitely disrupt energy supply and transportation. So there are many other examples of geopolitical risks, right? But what is certain is that companies are now more and more confronted with an expanded role of governments that want to actually influence corporate supply chain decisions. Okay, so what makes geopolitical risks differ from other types of supply chain risks, right, that we have dealt with before? Okay, first, if you think about the nature or the intention of geopolitical risks, right, they are primarily driven by the deliberate decisions of individuals, particularly those in positions of power within the governments, right? So think about, Donald Trump of the U.S. or Vladimir Putin from Russia, or Israel's Prime Minister, right, Benjamin Netanyahu. So this actually contracts with risks from, for example, natural disasters or pandemics, where the sources are non-purposeful and arise from natural causes, right? And in fact, if you think about the name, right, what is a geopolitical risk, right? It is driven by two components, political and geographic, right? So the political aspect indicates that disruptions are caused by government actions, right, based on country-specific political and economical interests. The geographic aspect highlights that these risks are typically tied to specific locations, right? So this will require, a strategic uh, uh, a country or entire region level perspective, right? That will consider the complexities of international relations, right? So that's the first difference. Second, uh, in terms of interaction, development, and persistency, right? Supply chain disruptions caused by natural disasters or supply failure, supply distress are typically localized, right? For example, some suppliers went down, right? So it would affect this one supplier or supply chains that include the supplier, right? So these typically only affect specific areas or very individual companies, right? But in contrast, if you think about geopolitical risks, they can actually impact all of the companies within a country or within a big region, right? Think about all the companies that currently do business in Mid East. So these are the companies that would be affected, right? In fact, also their supply chain, their suppliers, right, or their clients, right? So uh, uh, that's the scope of geopolitical risks, right? And in terms of duration, the impacts of geopolitical risk also tends to be longer in duration. Finally, I want to talk about predictability, right? So if you think about it, right, accurately predicting, the location and timing of natural disasters or epidemics, right, within a supply chain is nearly impossible, right? You don't know when or where, the earthquake is going to happen, right, until the very last moment, right? Even currently these days, we have very advanced modeling or data science tools. We will not be able to predict uh, uh, natural disasters, right? In contrast, if you think about geopolitical disruptions, right, they typically unfold gradually, right? Meaning that they will allow for a growing awareness of potential challenges in high-risk regions. So, for example, the example that we just talked about, right? Let's say Trump decides to impose tariffs, right, on products from other countries, but he always announce tariffs in advance, right? So it's a gradual process. So this makes uh, geopolitical risks somewhat predictable, right? At least managers, they can imagine, right, what is going to happen, what the scenario is going to happen, even though they cannot, 100% predict, right? Uh, so in the case of tariff, for example, if Trump announces tariff half a year or a year in advance, it will buy some companies some time to stockpile additional units if needed. Okay. Any questions so far? All right. So on the next slide, I'm going to talk about the different specific disruptors that geopolitical risks can lead to. Okay. So first one is a tariff, right? So we talked about this just now, right? If you impose tariff on imports from other countries, right, that will introduce a financial burden on the global supply chains, right? So they can undermine the long-term financial viability of supply chains because they can increase costs and they can also lead to uh, um, retaliation, right? They can lead to retaliatory actions, right, from the other country, right, the country that you impose uh, tariffs, right, and eventually this may escalate into a trade war, right? So we've heard of a U.S.-China trade war all the time, right? So that's tariff, okay? In prolonged international conflicts, right? For example, governments, they often impose sanctions, right, that will prohibit the trade of certain goods, services, and capital, right? So, for example, now the Western countries, as I mentioned before, have imposed many restrictions, many sanctions, right, on Russia, right? Uh, if you think about the scope of the restricted products, right, they can actually vary by case and can include, for example, military goods, right, or they can include what's so-called dual-use products. So dual-use products are those that have both military and civilian applications, right? Or even sanctions can include just very basic, very common everyday commodities, right? But this is going to be problematic for companies because for companies this means a fragmented supply chain, right? Where certain materials uh, suddenly become sanctioned, become unavailable, but other materials uh, uh, remain uh, unaffected. Okay, I don't know if that makes sense. Okay, so next one is taxes, right? So for companies managing global supply chain, maximizing after-tax profits is usually a key objective, right? So the goal is to make money. And the tax burdens imposed by various countries would significantly influence decision making, right? So a lot of companies actually would shift costs to high tax countries, right? Because in that case, it can reduce their overall tax exposure, right? So we are all familiar with the practice called transfer pricing, right? But you know, governments are also smart. They are actively work to counter such practices, right? Additionally, companies need to also consider trading balances in their supply network, right? Because if you have significant disparities, it will prompt the governments to impose retaliatory taxes or sanctions, right? So in that sense, a lot of companies are practicing what's so-called a natural hedging strategy in the sense that their trading balance uh, uh, almost cancel out, right? Almost close to zero. Armed conflicts, right, or wars, right? So if you think about wars, they can directly disrupt supply chains, right? In addition to sanctions, because when you have a war, you will have a labor shortage, right? You could have a infrastructure destruction. You could have supply chain disruption just because of the breakdown of public orders, right? And if you think about modern warfare, right, it typically also includes the cyber attacks, right? So that's another aspect that will disrupt the supply chain. Okay. The last one is actually very interesting, right? So I call it weaponized supply chain. So what is that, right? It means that the supply chains themselves can become a tool that is being used to weaken an enemy, okay, like a weapon, right? So for example, you probably have heard that Israel recently have set up an entire supply chain to sell pagers, right? Those electrical devices, pagers to Lebanese Hezbollah, right? So basically, the pagers contain bombs, right? So literally, they become a remote controllable means for precision attacks, right? Using these pagers, right? So that's an example of weaponized supply chain, right? A less dramatic example, right, that we all know of is the U.S. claim that Huawei, right, in 5G telecommunication networks, U.S. claims that Huawei enables our Chinese government to conduct surveillance and potentially, interact or hijack their networks, right? So that's U.S. claim. That's another example of a weaponized supply chain, right? To a less dramatic. Okay. All right. Any questions so far? So for the past 15 minutes, right, I've talked about the different forms of geopolitical risks, right? And I hope I know you agree that companies are uh, facing more and more geopolitical risks, right? So in light of these geopolitical risks, uh, and then that is happening, right? How should the companies adjust, their supply chain strategies accordingly, right, to deal with geopolitical risks, right? So that's important, right? And that's the basically the million-dollar question, right? So that's why our research team came up with a framework. Okay, so we came up with a framework, and in this framework, our recommended approach actually consists of three key elements. Okay, one, we recommend companies to prepare. Okay, so that number one step is to prepare by developing fundamental methodologies. Okay, for example, collecting data, defining future impactful scenarios. Okay, step two is to anticipate. Okay, is to conduct anticipatory strategies by developing either process adjustments or structural design changes. Okay, and finally, three, the companies have to react to disruptions as they occur, right? Through implementation of a wide range of short-term or long-term policies. Okay, so let me now actually break them down a little bit. Okay, so let's first talk about the first element of our framework. It focuses on basically gathering information to support effective planning. It's an exercise. Okay, it's a planning exercise. Basically, you need to gather information, right? This, for example, involves identifying potential future scenarios that could result in disruptions or changes to the operating environment of the supply chain, of the company's supply chain, right? This can include, geopolitical risk discussed earlier, or it can include other type of risk as well. Okay, so a critical aspect. Okay, I'm talking about bullet point B now. A critical aspect is real-time, global scale geopolitical risk monitoring. Right, so this is to ensure timely awareness of emerging threats. Right, so for example, in the US, companies like Cisco and Boeing, they have actually always implemented very extensive processes to achieve this. Okay, so they typically use a third-party provider to observe events on a global basis in real time. So it's very impressive. All right, it's basically a full-time job of the third-party provider. So these providers would report, for example, disruption at a particular location, and that would automatically trigger a playbook to drive interventions by the company right away to mitigate the impact, any negative impact on the supply chain performances. Okay, so the third component, bullet point C here, is the modeling and optimization, right? You need that because you need to think about the interactions between different decisions, material flows, and information flows, right? Because the goal is to enhance the supply chain overall resilience. You need the modeling and optimization to basically capture the consequences, right? To quantify the consequences of your planning exercise. Okay, so that's the first element, right? Basically getting information, imagine scenarios, right? The second element of our framework focuses on developing anticipatory strategies. Okay, what is an anticipatory strategy? Well, it is basically a proactive measure that will be implemented even before disruptions occur, right? So you want to be prepared, you want to be proactive, you want to do something even before the actual event happens, right? So for example, Trump now has announced the tariff. Sorry, so what do we do? What are our anticipatory strategies, right? So anticipatory strategies can include, for example, short-term inventory and the capacity adjustments, right? For example, Trump is going to impose a tariff. Maybe as a company, we should stockpile more units, right? That's an example I already mentioned. So that's an anticipatory strategy, right? So I'm doing that even before the event is going to happen. The event may not happen, right? Maybe US and China or Mexico or Canada, they work out some deals and the tariff is eventually canceled, right? But I'm already stockpiling units anyway. Okay, so this is a stockpiling, for example, is an example of short-term inventory or capacity adjustment, right? But it can also involve long-term, more complicated restructuring decisions. Okay, so why do we do this? Why do we believe anticipatory strategies are important? Because they can play a crucial role to one, reduce your supply chain's exposure to geopolitical risks, right? So for example, if I have stockpiled units, when tariff actually hits, I'm more prepared, right? And the two, anticipatory strategies will enable my step three, that is the reactive adaptations once disruption have occurred. Okay, so I'm going to mention that again when we talk about the step three. But if you don't do something before the disruption is coming, then when it actually comes, then you're going to get lost. You're going to take so much lead time to figure out what you need to do. Okay. So as I just mentioned, right, we distinguish between two types of anticipatory strategies, right? So the first type, the top bracket, right? The first type focuses on process adjustments, and the bottom bracket here focuses on network structure design. Okay, so process adjustments. So I'm talking about the company supply chain or operations process, right? So these adjustments can be relatively quick to implement, right? So for example, think about supply chain strategies like global directed buy agreement or risk-adjusted customer managed inventory, right? Which I'm going to tell you an example of a company doing that. Or just you want to streamline your process, right? So these strategies can adapt your supply chain processes to achieve, better or stronger or enhanced resilience. Okay, they usually require a short to medium time to implement, but they can be actually effective and cost efficient at the same time. Okay, so if you think about process adjustments, they typically allow the company to just continue using their existing supply chain structures or partners, right? You need probably additional safeguards. You need probably to reorganize your processes, but you can work with your existing, partners or supply chain footprint, for example. Okay. The lower bracket, on the other hand, so that focuses on network restructure. So that is basically modifying a company's supply chain footprint, right? So for example, if you think about what we call source diversification, right? That is for Western companies, they used to have manufacturing in China, but now they're also thinking about building factories in other parts or other countries in light of the geopolitical risk. Okay, so these strategies involve relatively long-term strategic decisions, right? Because, for example, if you want to relocate to a different country, those decisions will require board approval, right? Because of the complexity of the redesign of the supply chain, as well as the relatively very significant costs. Okay, so these supply chain redesigns are definitely very impactful, right? But they are only pursued, right, when your process adjustments are insufficient, right? So for example, think about the tariff, the example that I have been mentioning today, right? As a company, maybe I should first consider stockpiling more products, right? If it doesn't work or if the tariff seems going to last forever, then maybe I have to move my manufacturer capability to a country that is tariff free. Does that make sense? Okay, so that's the difference between short-term process adjustment and a long-term structural redesign. Okay, all right. So finally, uh, let's talk about the third and the last element of our framework, right? So we call that reactive adaptations, right? Which are adjustments made to my supply chain in response to disruption, right? So this is a reactive strategy, right? Which means that the disruption has already happened. You are reacting to whatever has occurred, right? Now, it's very important, and I mentioned before as well, these adaptations often rely on prior anticipatory strategies, right? If you think about the second step, these anticipatory strategies, these actually act as an investment, right, in your reactive adaptations, or what we call the real options, right? So it gives you option, not an obligation, right, to do something. So that's a real option, right? So examples of reactive adaptations can include reallocation production volume, right? Or reallocate, for example, material procurement, right, to backup sources, right? But I mean, if you want to reallocate your production, you had to, for example, secure suppliers, secure OEMs, right, even before the disruption happens, right? So that's an example of anticipatory strategies. You secure production capacity with a supplier. You don't produce anything, right? But you invest in the real option. You maybe pay some capacity or investment costs to make sure that if disruption really happens, you have a backup. And then when the disruption happens, when tariff strikes, now you are just going to use your contingency plan. You're going to say, okay, now I'm going to produce in whatever country that now I have backup capacity. So that is my reactive adaptation. Okay, all right. So so again, the key here is reactive adaptations can provide good mitigation of geopolitical risk disruptions, but they are only viable, they're only possible if you have made the necessary preparation investments, okay, beforehand. Okay. If you think about companies that are successful, or companies that are not successful, or companies that have went bankrupt during geopolitical risk, they often delay implementing resilience strategies until after disruption has occurred, right? And that's often too late, because then now they had to face challenges due to very long lead times, which will be required to structure their supply chain, right, or onboard the new suppliers, right? So therefore, again, I want to emphasize that when we have geopolitical risk, right, or in fact any kind of risk, it's very important that some measures have to be planned and adopted proactively rather than reactively, right, to in order to effectively address your geopolitical risks or disruptions. Okay. All right. Any questions about the framework? It's actually very general, right, but it's very systematic. So I hope that it's useful. Okay. So for the final 10 minutes, I want to talk about some company examples. Because our framework was in fact developed through interviews with leading multinational companies across different industries. Okay, so let me talk about actually 3 examples now. Okay, so the first company is a global manufacturer of agricultural machineries. Okay, they have factories across the Americas, across the Europe, across China, and they serve demand over I think 140 countries. Okay, so it's a very big company. Its supply chain is highly globalized. Okay, So what it is, its supply chain strategy. Okay, so its supply chain strategy is underpinned by what's so-called the preparation is everything. Okay, so their supply chain principle is preparation is everything. All right, so that's what I talked about when I discussed the framework just now as well. So in order to address geopolitical risks, this company's supply chain function or division, they continuously monitor and develop potential disruption scenarios. Okay, and for each scenario, they develop a playbook, right? Basically, a playbook is your action book, right? Out, outlining a predefined response plan. Okay, so they're very proactive, right? And this proactive approach uh, emphasize swift, very quick action in case that the supply chain disruptions really happen, because they have basically imagined all of it. They have prepared all of it, right? So whenever uh, in the advent of a supply chain disruption, the company will able to maintain operations, right? Because of the predefined response plan, they just act on it. They just act according to the playbook, while the competitors of this company are still trying to, formulate, solutions or responses, right? So that's basically this strategy. As you can see that they're going through the framework that I just talked about. Okay. Uh, a second example here is an American multinational technology company. Okay, so this company is also very big. It sells products in about 170 countries. Okay, so it's a global company. But this company somewhat faces very significant geopolitical risks because they have a high concentration of supply sources, primarily in a single country, which you may guess is China, all right? And this is a US company, so they're subject to meet customer demand, right? Remember, they have customers in over 170 countries. In order to meet customer demand for their high quality products and also at competitive prices, they want to make sure that uh, they always have product availability, right, with short delivery times, right? So what this company strategy is basically called a dual offense defense supply chain strategy. Okay, so the offense component focuses on centralizing production in locations with strong manufacturing expertise, competitive labor costs, right, such as China, right, so that they can enjoy economies of scale, right? So that's their basically offense, which is a centralized strategy, right? But meanwhile, they also have the defense strategy, okay? So the defense strategy involves diversifying supply chains, right? So they would establish additional production hubs in markets with low geopolitical risks, right? And they will, and these new hubs will be used to fulfill local content requirement, for example, okay? So in some sense, the offense strategies pulls your manufacturing into one or two countries, and the defense strategy spread out or diversify your manufacturing to reduce the geopolitical risk. Okay, did that make sense? Okay, so I'm illustrating their strategies based on our framework as well. Okay, our final and the third example is a European manufacturer. Okay, it produces home appliances, large home appliances, right? And because of the very bulky, heavy nature of its products, the company's supply chain traditionally is highly regionalized. So they use what's so-called a local for local production. The biggest source of geopolitical risk for this company's supply chain is actually from its lower tier suppliers, because even though this company is using a local for local production approach, its lower tier suppliers have a globalized production network, right, which can be potentially affected by trade disruptions or geopolitical disruptions. Okay, so that's why the focus of this company is to develop an end-to-end view of its supply chain. Okay, what does it mean? An end-to-end view of a supply chain means it wants to obtain transparency with respect to not only its biggest supplier, but its tier two, tier one, tier two, tier three suppliers whatsoever. All right, and find out what are the risk exposure to these smaller, much smaller companies. Okay, uh, uh, because these suppliers are smaller, right? They may not have a mature supply chain risk management function, right? So this big company, this European manufacturer needs to support it, right? Because otherwise, when the tariff hits, if these smaller suppliers go down, then your company will go down. Your company will not be able to produce also, right? So basically, the company's main job is to support the suppliers' risk management. They share, for example, forecasted data with these smaller suppliers. They monitor disruption risk for these smaller suppliers. They share risk assessment. They share action plans with these suppliers. And in fact, one of the things that they do, as you can see here, is they try to manage inbound inventory as a form of customer managed inventory. In other words, they're going to manage the supplier's inventory, right? Why? What's the benefit? Because if you manage a supplier inventory, right, you can basically create safety buffers, right? You can reduce the disruption risk even when no alternative suppliers become available in light of disruption, because you still have some stock, some parts available. Okay. All right. So this is the third example. So these three examples are very different companies, and they all have very different strategies. But as you can see, all of them are using our framework, right? Okay. So this is my last slide, and in this last slide, basically to conclude my presentation today, I would like to discuss some general managerial takeaways. Okay. If you think about geopolitical risks, right, the relationships between countries certainly becomes relevant. So the first advice or the first managerial takeaway is that instead of considering a country's internal political stability, right, be because geopolitical risks are defined by the interaction of different countries for one country with another, companies need to actually consider inter-country relationships, right, in addition to firm level or country level risks. Okay. And the second, the source of geopolitical risk often lies in the decisions of a small number of high-ranking government officials, right? I talked about this earlier today as well. So in order to assess geopolitical risk, companies need to understand the decision-making process, right, and the distribution of political power, right, among the government leaders, right? So that becomes crucial for assess geopolitical risk, right? In other words, if a company outsources information gathering to a third party, it needs to make sure that this third party has, the right relationship, has the right staff. Okay. Next, sorry. Next, analyzing the impact of geopolitical disruption and think about a global supply chain structure is actually very complex task, right? So it requires a lot of data, a lot of information, high levels of data availability and transparency, right? That's the downside. But the good side is this supply chain data can be leveraged to develop your resilience strategies, right? They can connect decisions to a company's performance outcomes, right? Using a model and optimization, as I mentioned before. So whatever your goal is, right, including, for example, your cost, your revenue, profits, customer satisfaction, or whatever your competitive advantage is. Okay. Excellent. Financial flows, right? Financial flows are always tied to material flows within a global supply chain, right? We know that when, for example, goods across borders, they always trigger various cash flows, right? The problem of financial flows is that they are always influenced by factors such as taxes or foreign exchange rate, right? Foreign exchange volatility. And this volatility can actually escalate during geopolitical disruptions. So therefore, to evaluate the impact of geopolitical strategies across different scenarios, it is very important to account for your cash flow properly. Okay, and finally, um, many traditional resilience strategies could be performed by a company on its own, right? So for example, if you want to improve your inventory management, or if you want to conduct supplier diversification. But in the case of geopolitical risk, disruptions are usually dependent on supplier location choices. So that means unilateral changes in a company's production location will be insufficient to address geopolitical risks, right? Instead, company need to evaluate their supply chain from an end-to-end perspective. They need to align their resilience approach with their suppliers. Okay, I think that's all I want to talk about. I want to finish my presentation by saying thank you, and also by saying that, despite these general managerial insights that I just mentioned, uh, after talking to a lot of companies, what we realize is that there is, in fact, no one-size-fits-all strategy, right, for hedging geopolitical risk, because there can be different forms of geopolitical risk. Each company's optimal resilience approach can vary based on each company's unique supply chain characteristics and the specific goal, or risks that they have, right? Yet, the framework that I presented today, right, the prepare, the being proactive and then react, the framework that I presented today, we hope that it can be useful, right? Because we think that it can help most individual companies to structure their thinking, structure their approach to navigating, the best strategies to deal with geopolitical risks. Okay, that's all I want to talk about.